Hello and a warm welcome. You're watching my YouTube station, Smita Sharma, journalist, and the entire world is, of course, watching the developments play out across the Middle East, the Gulf. News this morning that came in that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been killed in a major attack by the United States and the Israel in an operation that was carried out near his home in downtown Tehran. Of course, for the past 24 hours, we have seen major cities across Tehran being bombed, and then the Iranian retaliatory strikes across US air bases in the Middle East, in the Gulf. We've also seen countries like Saudi, Qatar come together to condemn the Iranian retaliatory action. The Israelis have called it a preemptive strike when they went in for those operations named as Epic Fury by the United States. But to make sense of it all and what really happens next with Khamenei killed in these operations, the 86-year-old Iranian supreme leader, who actually was the longest serving head of the state in the Middle East. He had been in power since 1989. I'm joined here by Professor Moshik Temkin, who is a historian. He's also an author. Thank you so much for finding time to join me in this conversation, Professor Temkin. Uh, your initial reactions on what you've seen so far, what you've heard so far, especially in terms of the scale, the nature of these operations?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to speak to your audience about this. These are very important events, and in some ways very historic events, right? It's a relatively new thing in world affairs where we have the taking out of a national leader, especially someone who has been there for as long as the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has been there, right? So we are talking about a major event. We don't know yet, and I don't think anybody can say what the repercussions of this event will be. There is, of course, this initial reaction of that a change is coming, and many observers, especially in the West, are not were never very fond of the supreme leader of Iran, and they might be tempted maybe to celebrate to some extent. But we know from history, and this is a very key thing, that once you escalate at this level, it's very hard to anticipate what will follow. And so I would like to remind everyone that these kinds of systems and these kinds of, especially a state at this level of importance and complexity, never revolves around just one person. This is a regime that has been there since 1979. It has very deep roots in Iran, and we simply don't know what will come next.
Yes, President Donald Trump, of course, announcing that death, saying that it gives Iranians the greatest chance to take back their country. There's a lot of rhetoric that has, of course, been flowing in both with Donald Trump and Netanyahu. The Iranians also pointing to the fact that these strikes happened, remember, once again at a time when the Americans and the Iranians were in the middle of talks about the nuclear program in Geneva. Just like last year, we saw in June when the talks were ongoing, and that's when the Americans went ahead and hit the nuclear installations. But there was a lot of contradiction because they claimed that the nuclear capacity had been obliterated, but yet they make the nuclear program as their reason and justification for going after Iran. What do you really see as the real justification, Professor Temkin, here?
Yes. So again, to reiterate something that I said before, one need not be a huge fan of the Iranian regime, and I am not one, to see the context here, which is that the Iranians had been engaged quite a while now in diplomatic efforts with the United States and with other countries regarding their nuclear program, which was for the most part about enrichment. And according to most international observers, their nuclear option of weapons was off the table, had been for quite a while. In fact, there had been already a nuclear agreement with Iran achieved under President Obama during Obama's presidency. And so this is already the second time, it already happened last year, that the United States, in the midst of negotiations with the Iranian regime, attacks Iran. It happened last year and it's happening again this year, it seems, with an escalation. So one cannot help but notice that there is an element of bad faith on the part of the Americans when they, in essence, join the Israeli government in attacking Iran. Israel and Iran have long-standing bad blood. But of course, many observers, and especially the public, including inside the United States, see this latest attack on Iran as a product, not so much of what the Iranians were doing or not doing, but in terms of the alliance between the United States and Israel, and the Americans almost automatically supporting Israel's interests and incentives in the region.
But Professor Temkin, I mean, even while Donald Trump, of course, may go ahead and make these tall claims, at the end of the day, when every time there is this regime change operation, we know that Iran is not a Syria. We know that Iran is not the other countries. Iran already had in place several rounds and rungs of succession prepared to take over from Khamenei because they knew that the strike was imminent. So, is this really even a regime change from the American definition?
It depends how we define regime change. I am sure that the Americans don't like the regime in Iran, and I know the Israelis don't like the regime in Iran. The feeling is mutual, by the way. So I don't think it's a one-sided affair. But I don't really see the Americans certainly don't have a plan for what comes after if there were a regime change. And Donald Trump, who is not a very sophisticated person to begin with, saying things like, "Oh, it's time for the Iranian people to take the country back." That doesn't really mean anything if you don't have a program. In fact, we know that some of the attacks have actually targeted even opposition leaders in Iran. And those who have for years been trying to reform and democratize the country. Some of those people, including most of those people, are no more fans of the United States government or of Israel than the current regime is. So I fear that, and I don't mean to sound too cynical and alarming, but I fear that the plan here, at least from the side of the Israelis, and let's not forget they're involved in this, is not necessarily to create a regime change to something specific, but really to create a power vacuum, to create chaos, to weaken Iran, generally speaking. The last time Iran had a different regime was before 1979, when the Shah ruled Iran, and he was a US-backed dictator. And before that, you have to go back to the early 1950s, when Iran did have a democratic government led by Mohammad Mossadegh, and he was overthrown by a coup led by the United States and Great Britain. So we don't really have a clear alternative to this regime. We don't know what comes next. And I fear that the point is not to say, oh, let's take care of the people in Iran. It's more, let's create such weakness and instability in Iran that they cease to become any kind of factor geopolitically in the region.
I would want to ask you today, looking at the kind of presidency in Donald Trump that we see in America, a leader who came in on the promise of no war. I mean, here it is a limited airstrike, some may say, but it doesn't look like a war that is going to get wrapped up in 12 days. The Iranians have, of course, threatened that they're going all out with their retaliation. We'll have to see what comes next, whether it's Israel, whether it's American bases. So, what is really the kind of backing that Donald Trump has at this point in time for going ahead with this situation back home?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I hope I will not be accused of being too cynical in my viewpoint, but it's actually kind of sad when you think about it. In fact, Donald Trump campaigned very clearly on no more wars. He did it for the first time in 2016, and then he did it again in 2024. It was very clear from his campaign that he saw American entanglements of wars of this sort as something that hurt American first interest, which is what he campaigned on. And in fact, to this day, there is very little appetite inside the United States for another war in the Middle East. In general, the president's approval ratings are extremely low in the United States. And I suspect it's not an accident because historically we know that launching wars, especially when you take out a leader or you bomb a country and you don't have casualties of your own yet, it tends to give you a boost in the polls. And so I think that, United States, we call it wag the dog, where you kind of distract from your own political domestic problems. And Mr. Trump has many domestic problems. He's very weak politically in terms of support at the moment with this bombing campaign. Israel, it's a very similar situation in the sense that Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he's the main character here because he has been pushing for this kind of attack for decades now. um, is basically embroiled in a scandal in the country, and he's always hanging on by the, by the skin of his teeth, as we say. And this kind of permanent warfare and permanent conflict with Iran is in his own personal interest, both not just ideological and geopolitical, but also in terms of his own political survival. So it's quite sad and surprising to some degree, at least from the American side, to see Trump, whose his rise to power is very much linked to a critique, as unsophisticated as it was, of the Iraq War previously and of American entanglements abroad, with a focus on the need for domestic rejuvenation, to simply go the same path as these prior presidents like President Bush and others, and launch this attack in the Middle East, leads many to this kind of cynical conclusion that there is something permanently repetitive about American politics and foreign policy, that even in the end, President Trump kind of goes down the same path.
But Professor Temkin, keeping in mind from where you come from, explain to us that how is it that the Jewish lobby manages to get its way in a way that the oldest democracy in the world, which otherwise tries shining a light upon everybody else about international rules-based order, that it can be played by Netanyahu time and again?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say the Jewish lobby. There is in the United States the Israel lobby, and the Israel
Yes.
lobby is very influential. It consists of Jewish people, but it actually mostly nowadays consists of very important, what we call Christian Zionists and other interested parties that see a complete, in fact, any lack of distinction between Israeli, fairly right-wing interests and American interests. And you can talk about politicians, non-Jewish politicians like Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio. It's a very long list of people who say remarkably similar things, that there is no daylight whatsoever between what Netanyahu wants and what American interests are. Of course, most of the American public nowadays actually disagrees with that notion. But as I said before, it seems that there are powerful factors that keep pushing the Americans to basically follow the Pied Piper here. Again, Netanyahu getting his way. But I wouldn't just ask the question about Donald Trump and others. We just saw Prime Minister Modi visit Israel, embrace Netanyahu very warmly, give a nice speech in parliament about how they're best friends. He returns home, and then 3 days later, Israel attacks Iran and starts a regional war. So we have to ask the question, why is the entire international community, including the Europeans, Western Europeans, including India, including the United States, basically kind of following down this path of, it's not even the Israeli interest. I think it's the interest of Netanyahu specifically, and of his political universe, his group. So it is a major question, and I think that part of it is a lack of foresight about what needs to be done geopolitically in terms of really achieving a stable, peaceful Middle East. And in order to achieve a stable, peaceful Middle East, people are going to have to take off their ideological blinders. They're going to have to kind of rethink very major geopolitical issues and come to the conclusion that there is, in fact, a need for both some kind of secure, stable, peaceful state of Israel, but there needs to also be freedom, justice, and independence for the Palestinian people, which this is really the core issue in the Middle East, I think. And everything else has to follow from that. There is even an argument that the whole conflict between Iran and Israel really revolves around this question, essentially. Okay, so the path to peace and stability does not lie in taking out or assassinating specific individuals. It has to do with fixing the structural problems that are taking place in the Middle East. And neither President Trump, nor Prime Minister Modi, nor the European community, and certainly not the Israeli government, seem anywhere near to proposing the correct solutions to this problem.
Absolutely. And there are a large section of journalists here in India. We have been questioning the timing of that Modi visit to Israel because it absolutely seems baffling. It happened at a time when it did. And also the fact that, the genocide in Gaza was really not mentioned in that speech in Knesset. And this keeping in mind the fact that India has traditionally been one of the biggest supporters of the Palestinian cause. Also, Iran has, is a very, very important strategic ally for India as well. So, with the Indian diaspora in the Middle East, in the Gulf, the remittances that come in, the energy security, everything is very complicated for India right now. But Professor Temkin, I would want to ask you about how you look at the reactions that have come in from the Arab states and the non-Arab states too. I mean, countries like Pakistan actually going out there and supporting Israel at this point in time. Saudi, of course, condemning those Iranian attacks that have happened, including some of the drones that have hit civilian places in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. How do you look at that shaping up right now?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to sit in judgment of some of these governments. I think they're in survival mode. I think that there's a lot of opportunism and even some cynicism in these reactions. I don't think that there's necessarily great love for the government of Israel or for President Trump. But I think that a lot of these leaders are fairly, to be honest, weak and ineffectual at the moment and thinking very narrowly about short-term interests. And so they look around and they say, well, right now, the power, these Americans have so much power. And Mr. Trump is capable of delivering such devastating effects on so much of the world that we need to be on his good side at all times. You can even see it in how even, in India or even Pakistan, other countries in the Middle East are kind of trying to always improvise based on what they think their short-term interests are. And so that's, I think, the best way to explain these reactions. But I have to remind everyone, all these world leaders, Middle Eastern leaders, and leaders of India, that they need to understand that at the end, Netanyahu's interests are his own interests. And no matter what ideological affinities certain leaders think that they have between themselves and the Israeli government, at the end of the day, the Israelis do not consider this to be a reciprocal affair. Trust me when I say that Mr. Netanyahu does not spend any time thinking about sort of Mr. Modi's ideological concerns or the way that he understands the relationship between India and the world or anything like that. He is cynically exploiting some of these relationships in order to achieve what he wants. And so I'm surprised that such a savvy political operator like Mr. Modi would simply just walk into that so easily. I'm not sure quite what he was thinking, but I don't think he was thinking very clearly about what Israel does and what its interests are.
Just the last two questions, Professor Temkin. I mean, at the end of the day, while there are a lot of visuals coming in, and many of these visuals are on social media, we cannot independently verify, of large crowds turning up, whether it's Tehran, whether it's Isfahan, mourning Khamenei's killing. There are also those who are either within Iran or outside Iran who are celebrating it and saying that an autocrat, that a dictator has been killed. Um, if you look back at Khamenei's era, 1989 onwards, compared to his predecessor, Khamenei. What do you think, Khamenei should have, most importantly, done differently? And how did Tehran change? How did Iran change under Khamenei?
Yes, so this is a historical question. So I want to say two things at the same time. On the first, I would not overestimate the place and the role of Khamenei himself. I understand that he is the supreme leader, but we are talking not about a monarchy, and we are not talking about a dictator in any real individual sense. This is a regime that has very deep roots. Khamenei is simply the top person in that regime. But because you kill him, it doesn't mean that you have actually replaced the regime. We don't really have an alternative to this regime. There has been, for decades now, an internal struggle in Iran between the regime itself and between opposition forces outside of it. Many of these people are under house arrest. There are many factors inside Iranian society that would like to have a democracy, that would like to give equal rights to women, that would like to have better relationships with the world, that are not interested in oppression and in war. These people and groups have been ruthlessly suppressed, and so we ought to support them because we want for the Iranian people the same freedoms that we would want for anyone else. And even as we stand against this particular regime and in favor of positive forces in Iranian society, we also have to remember that usually, historically, good things do not happen when you simply take out a leader and create chaos, because sometimes what comes next can be even worse. And so it would have been much better to give support to groups inside Iran that have connections to the West, that would have true democratic aspirations, rather than bomb a country and in fact kill civilians. They bombed a school. We know now from reports that there are possibly up to 100 little girls who were killed in this school. That is not a path for positive regime change. And of course, the Iranians are going to retaliate. We can't expect them to just sit very passively and absorb everything. Their goal is to try to hit other Arab countries in the Middle East and try to create pressure then for the U.S. to stop this bombing. So maybe I sound a little bit Pollyannish about this, but I never think that it is through attacking civilians that we achieve a better world or a more peaceful world. I think that what we achieve through that is simply suffering and a cycle of violence that never ends.
Absolutely. I think very, very pertinent points that you have made. Let me also just inform the viewers that as far as Indian nationals overseas are concerned, the embassies, consulates are constantly putting out advisories for foreign travelers who are stuck here with all the airspaces closed. The Indian government has issued an advisory asking you to go and reach out to the foreign registration office for extension of visas where required. But one final question, Professor Temkin. We just have Donald Trump's reaction coming in, where he has written again that Iran just stated that they are going to hit very hard today, harder than they have ever hit before. They better not do that. However, because if they do, we will hit them with a force that has never been seen before. Thank you for your attention to this matter, quintessentially Trump. Your final thoughts on how do you crystal gaze the next couple of days? Do you see it getting to a situation where you cannot rule troops on the ground?
I mean, I don't know what he's going to do with troops on the ground. That would be, in my opinion, that would be catastrophic, not just for Iran, at least the people in Iran, but even for American society. American society, the last time they sent troops on the ground was Iraq, and that was a disaster politically for the country. And before that, it was Vietnam. For those who remember that history, that is also a disaster. So these things in recent decades do not end well. What I suspect might more plausibly happen is increased bombing. And we've seen that there are almost no limits to this. The United States has major air power. They also have nuclear power. I don't know what this president is capable of doing. I don't think that he thinks about this programmatically or rationally. I think that he is reasoning in ways that have to do with people's attention, with polls, with the kind of reactions that he gets from favorable media. He is surrounded also by some people who give him advice that is a very militaristic and violent. I don't know if he quite understands what this path can lead to, because he's not exactly someone who thinks historically about these issues. But I also think there's a lot of bluster here. We see him write things like this quite often, right? And menace using enormous power to attack and so on and so forth. He tends to shift his attention from one thing to another. We might be talking about something completely different in 1 week or 2 weeks, but we might also see him do something quite drastic. So I'm sorry, I don't have a definitive answer, or I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know one thing, that once you go down the path of bombing a country like this and then attempting regime change, so-called regime change, without actually supporting those who could plausibly create an alternative to the current regime, this usually ends with months and sometimes years of violence, instability, and chaos, not just for the country itself, but for the region. And so while I have no affinity or affection or support for Mr. Khamenei, we see here in this image, or anyone particularly in that regime, which is an oppressive regime, I think that in order to really attack it, in order to replace it. You have to deal with the structural issues that are underlying its power and its problems. And again, to repeat something sad, which I said before, in that sense, the leadership that I see in both in Asia and in Europe and elsewhere, unfortunately, is not on the right path to doing that.
Right. Thank you so much, like always, Professor Temkin, of course, for those perspectives that you bring into our conversations. And to our viewers who are watching the show, he has an excellent book out there. He's authored a book called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, which is a very, I think it's of interest to see how leadership is shaping up, the context to it, and more relevant today than ever. So thank you so much, Professor Temkin, for joining me here.
Thank you
And
very much.
all I can say is that we are living in absolute chaotic, turbulent times. We have not seen these many number of conflicts coexisting at the same time. I think perhaps since the Cold War, since the Second World War, this is the most turbulent time that the world is going through. It's exhausting. The lives of children in Gaza, the lives of children in Iran should matter equally as, of course, lives lost elsewhere. So let's just hope that there are ways of de escalating and better leadership that can provide better direction to the world and the region. Many thanks for all those who tuned in and watched the show. Take care.